Yeah, so
Actually,
started
for something a little bit more solemn.
trying.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Lower Connecticut River Land Trust Summer Meeting of Thursday, August 15th, 2024. We do not have a quorum at this time, so we're not going to be able to approve the minutes of June 20th, 2024. For the members of the board, you should have received copies of them. Feel free to take a look at them. If you have comments, questions, feel free to pass them along in the meantime, and then we'll take them up at our next regular scheduled meeting next month. With that, we'll move on to, I guess, an update, since we're really not having an official meeting regarding the strategic conservation plan update. I know, do you want to kind of go over our last conversation with Park Service?
Yeah, so we had our second meeting with them on Tuesday. And we looked at what everybody sent back for available meeting times, and it looks like 1 to 3 in the afternoon on our regular meeting day is the best time for most people to meet. So we're gonna go with that, if that's okay with everybody. So that was one of my tasks, to make sure that that was good to go. And then we looked at the other dates that I had sent, and that was Thursday, November 21st, Thursday, January 16th. And then I had sent out Thursday, February 20th with you guys, which is good, but it might go to March, because that's the week that's President's Day week. So I'm not sure how many people will be available that week. So just to put that out there, that might change to March. And then we went over what their thoughts were on what the first meeting might look like. And she's gonna put the agenda together and send it for comment, but she thought what she would start with was to just talk to you and see what's on your minds about the conservation plan, that we now have the existing plan. Review the 2014 plan, go over the meeting schedule, and then go over updated tools and updated layers that might be available for us. And then that would be the second meeting. And then the third meeting will be creating the methodology, and the fourth meeting will be finalizing the methodology. And then we'll see how we get through all of this. And I did put in the grant for a possible 5th and 6th meeting, but I'm really working towards just doing 4. We did it last time in 4, and we should be able to, I think, do it in 4. So
Yeah, but all the meetings leading up to that. I
yes,
hope we don't go, well, we shouldn't, because we already have a product, we shouldn't have to go through that again.
yes, right. So hopefully it'll go smoothly, but that's what we talked about at the last meeting. And the biggest thing is determining that meeting time of 1 to 3 in the afternoon. So.
And Sam was going to provide lunch for everyone. At that
Right,
meeting.
with lunch. No, it
I'm
doesn't.
just joking, Sam. I'm just teasing.
No, it is with lunch though,
Oh,
actually.
okay.
For those that come, it's gonna be a hybrid meeting.
And we are stressing for board members to be present at these meetings, obviously. And I think it might be good for us, and I don't know how the staff feels, but maybe having just a day to kind of go over ahead of time before we actually start the process, our conservation plan that we currently have, just so that we are all kind of get acquainted to it and educated with it, just so that we're speaking intelligent. Would be a worthwhile experience. So maybe, I don't know, we want to put that on the next agenda or something that we schedule for down the road.
Well, the first meeting is only 4 weeks or 5 weeks away. So we would have, maybe we could take the pre-meeting that we usually have
Sure, yeah.
and do it, or, maybe I could send out a schedule to see if people would prefer to do it at night or what. I know that you're gonna have a rough work schedule.
Yeah, for the first month.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, let's send it out and,
Okay.
and maybe we could just do something via Zoom anyways, and
Okay.
just kind of go over things. I think
Okay.
that would be beneficial for everyone.
yeah.
So. Anything else from the board members? The update. Nope. Sam, anything else from your end? Hope you're feeling better. You're on mute, Sam.
Sorry about that. No, I'm doing okay. I don't have COVID, but I've had a cold, and I look incredibly red on this camera. We've been doing site walks all week. I spent last few days outside doing site walks, and I don't think I'm this red in reality, but the camera makes me look red. I guess the only update I have is about the Osaki house, but I think that we're still getting some clarification on that, so maybe that would be better saved for another meeting. But I can talk about that now, or we can save it for another time.
I mean, we could save it for another time. It's not really on the agenda, so
Yeah, no, but I can brief you on that another time.
Thank you.
I just wanted to,
Please.
introduce myself. I'm Alan Pomansky. I'm here, instead of Barbara Proconi of the East Haddam Land Trust.
Excellent. Thank
Great,
you.
thank
Thank
you.
you for coming. So our presentation starts at 6, which is the next item on the agenda. I don't want to necessarily start before 6, just in case people are looking to join remotely. So if that is okay with everyone, we'll just take a brief hiatus so that you can continue to eat and grab a beverage if you would like. And then Hank, if you need a setup prior to 6, I guess this would be a good time to set up if you needed to set up. Great. All right.
There's
So-
cookies and brownies too.
Yeah, we should-
We've already eaten.
Thank you for dinner. This is very nice.
I missed the date.
I heard Eliza made it all.
I made it all in the toaster oven.
Well, thank you, Eliza.
Jenny still seems to be one of the.
Do you want me to make you more?
Doesn't have to be that, and I know. I don't know how you. Once you jump on.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no.
No, I
If Jenny wants
I
to.
did national workshop with the Audubon and,
2 hours yesterday.
Oh,
I was
this
hurrying to preserve, so I spent 2 hours the day before.
Oh,
Okay.
2 hours.
Yeah.
Kill, preserve. Have to be back there
I
tomorrow
was on
morning
a.
to be.
I recognize the face. I walked
Stone for a driveway.
I tried to part of
Then from there, I'm going back to Carini Preserve. I need a carpenter to try to work on a sign on board for it, so it's every single day.
Okay. You're a lot busier than.
Well,
Just
met,
Vernal?
Day after day after day after day.
Yeah.
I noticed on the
Couple
stone.
weeks ago,
she's, just emailed me a question. Big sun is there, that's high on my.
Yeah.
field.
There's a lot.
So that one probably be there tomorrow.
Yeah.
On a project site and.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't mind filling in or.
It's very exciting.
Special.
Yeah, we kind of blind, used to have kind of like cousin ones.
Because
Oh,
the Hank talk about is we can start down.
Yeah.
Resources.
Yeah.
There's a flourishing map.
Yes.
This exercise was, and then,
During COVID.
you know, putting some meanings.
I guess her COVID angst was taken out on the
The efforts
basis
will
of.
overlap, or at least have
Which were
goals and.
got a stewardship, working.
The idea for Chester Natural Resources in Pennsylvania was to identify what.
I was,
That's important.
I'm always seeing your headquarters, so
And
I was with the wild ones.
And
And you graciously allowed us to have our
we don't have a.
Christmas.
It's kind of.
The old line?
At the old.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And, you hung around, I think we talked a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm.
Yeah.
We just skip up.
And then,
Jim was.
Alex.
Oh, okay.
So,
Working with these.
then,
If Jenny's the.
I was always
official
interested in
person,
why.
Yeah.
We were doing.
I'll
Would
talk
it be
to
okay
her.
if you-
Say, well,
Yeah.
I think it's funny.
Yeah.
She's seen that.
Running started well.
I don't.
Yeah.
Stuff.
60 years.
Yeah.
I feel incredible fortunate, but.
That's not a good sign.
Yeah, we So they,
part of it now, but.
we didn't. So you're doing a lot of field work this summer in this great weather?
Like more selectmen.
If they need it, and then, if they have time, which they.
Some pretty good company, but also kind of so.
Yeah, it was in fact, we have.
Yep, yep, sure. Yeah. I don't.
Which is
Yep.
actually.
Peter.
He's good, he's good,
I know you mentioned.
yeah,
to me that
yeah, he's,
Backed up.
you know, he took an early retirement from UConn years ago.
House.
But he has,
Yeah.
like, he's got an appointment at the aquarium
New house.
now, and they pay him several months a year.
An office space and.
Yeah,
we
we-
can have a
We're
tag.
doing a bond rating.
But he's really talking about stepping down at the end
Next
of the
week.
year.
Added.
Yeah. Well, he never will, he never will, and that's great, you know, but, you know, he's happy stirring the pot, and he's, emeritus on things. What we'd like to see is the aquarium come up with a transition plan, somebody to continue conservation work that he's been doing. And they're like, well, why would you ask someone live here? They're not getting it, you know? He's like, no, you take this money, give that to them, and all thought, you know, but we want somebody like in place who knows what you're doing. Serve like the fisheries management council and be involved with the canyons and sea monument and all that stuff. So, yeah, so he's a little frustrated because he can't seem to get him to buy it, exactly. And they're always, you know, they're always looking at the bottom line, you know, numbers to the door, I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, key exhibits and that kind of stuff. So it's stuff, yeah, but he's good, he's still.
Tell him I said hi.
I will, absolutely, yeah. So I actually
Not sure.
signed up for a year of ArcGIS.
Affordable, he had that.
Really nice. Because I was having trouble doing a couple of things on the free version, and I was just getting frustrated with it. But then I'll admit, I kind of lost my steam on it a little bit. So it's good for me to get back and listen to you again and think about those.
So the problem is you don't need to get raw of.
Oh, God, yeah. Oh, man. Oh, man. I know. And what I, you know, it took me a couple of weeks just to remember how to do basic things. And
Yeah, we have, you know. the
Yeah.
archives and
when I
stuff,
left,
conservation
the DEP was going to GIS Pro, which looks a lot like GIS. Yes and no, I mean, we will track locations and, but most of it was like, it was really like looking at somebody's property and figuring out where to house and how that was, and that kind of thing. But no, we did do some, yeah, those state lines, absolutely, yeah.
I'd like to do that.
Yeah, that, so that's a good hands now.
Yeah. I don't think.
Yeah.
I've heard of both.
Crazy.
It was, that was an interesting struggle, and,
They know.
and after we got all the data, it's
I think
Exactly where it is, right?
like,
At the
this is
time.
messy. Some of this wasn't really right, and so, you know, so trying to go back to things, we found out like Lebanon area, like, that whole focus area was based on road kills on Route 2. Yeah, they were never DNA verified, they probably weren't whatever. And so, you know, so it's like stuff like that, that we, at long after the fact, you start looking at this stuff, it's like, why not this whole area?
Oh, wow.
That was a 10-year.
Yeah.
Like, well, they probably were never.
So that was a big drill.
And then there was some stuff on this side of the town, from that focus area, focus area, and the side of the river.
Trying to have them.
It was.
What we know about more than what operation. How much?
So we tried to make those modifications as we went, but I think overall the story, you know, the data tells the story over time, is that Eastern Connecticut really isn't served. Popular letter.
This,
We're really doing the herb stuff.
Yeah.
I got stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and like,
Oh, people moving around.
and then they've seen color.
And I tell you what, I-
You know. So
So
they manipulated.
There's one that showed up.
Color, but you don't have to do that mathematically. No. What it is, you can't see the color.
Yeah.
It's our eye. So if it goes through it, it's
Yeah.
you go to Iceland.
one was near,
You see
there
the
was,
borealis.
I mean, you know, you see.
I've seen it. Oh, my goodness.
Alright, so
If you put it through the camera, you can see all kinds of colors.
it is,
Wow.
6 o'clock or 1 after 6, and I know that, it is Thursday, and I wanna try to stick to the time frame as much as possible. And I appreciate everyone coming out today, and I don't know if we have anyone joining remotely besides Sam, so thank you for joining us, Sam. But I wanna thank our presenter, Hank Gruner, for coming today to kind of give us a quick presentation about vernal pools and their impact to our ecological systems here throughout Connecticut. And I don't want to go into I don't want to read everything that's already on the paper they have in front of you, but with that, I'll pass it off to you so that you can give your presentation and we could really just dive into the meat and potatoes of what you're here for. So thank you very much, Hank, for coming out today.
Okay, well, thank you for having me and welcome to the folks in Zoom land too. So let me just give you a quick background on me. I'm retired from the Connecticut Science Center where I did a lot of work primarily focused on science education. But my life has always been a balance between the education side, working in museums on science education, and then working as a herpetologist doing research primarily in the Northeast, Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts mainly on amphibians and reptiles. And was recently part of a team that published a book on Connecticut's conservation of Connecticut's amphibians and reptiles. And continue, even though I'm retired, I continue to do a lot of work with broad groups, developers who are working on, as you know, projects, solar fields and agriculture and, you know, residential development and so forth. Groups such as yourself on conservation and work very closely with the state folks and the biologists on the planning and conservation. So we're keeping very active with it. So what I'm going to do tonight with vernal pools is that really I just give you a summary of what I would hope to cover here to give you an introduction on. One is sort of a brief overview of vernal pools. I don't know how much you know about them, so I'll just go through briefly. I've got some slides to talk about what they are and a little bit about why they're important. And I want to highlight some of the elements in that introduction that really are critical to understanding about stewardship. If you're looking at going into stewardship for vernal pools and conservation of vernal pools, there's certain key understandings that are important to know that guide any mapping that you might do, any data collection that you might do, and any planning for conservation. Then I'll review briefly the conservation challenges associated with vernal pools, and then focus on stewardship. Really, you know, what does it mean? You know, what are the goals and how do we achieve that? What's the scales that it works at? And I'll use some of the examples from the work that we're doing. I'm on our Conservation Commission in the town of Andover, very small town with 3,000 people in Eastern Connecticut, very limited resources, but we're in the process of completing a natural resource inventory as a guiding document within our plan of conservation and development, which is due in 2025. Those are towns basically do those every 10 years. So I'll show some of the examples of how we've approached that with vernal pools in particular, how we've approached some of the planning and how we got through using various resources with the limitations that we've had. Okay, so that's sort of the overview of it. Not working. Want to click it? There we go. All right, I'm gonna have to rely on you, okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so vernal pools, basically a key thing is that they dry up. The key thing is that they're temporary, they're not permanent. And this is there's a lot of variability on how long they hold water in a season. which has big implications on the species that will use them. So that's an important understanding when we think about mapping pools and conservation of pools. Every pool is not the same. What we try to look at is a diversity of hydrologies. And the hydrology can vary year to year. So you can have a year like this year was a very good year for vernal pools because we had a fair amount of rain throughout the summer. We didn't hit a period where we had large dry periods, droughts, where they tend to dry up very quickly, especially when leaf out. So this has been a very good year where many of them have remained recharged and have held water. So consequently, we'll probably get some good amphibian reproduction out of them. But next year, we could have zero reproduction out of many pools because they could dry up early. So they're very variable year to year. So a key understanding is knowing that any snapshot of a year, even 2 years, even 3 years, is very limited picture of really what's going on with a pool. And their hydrologies can range anywhere from, just a couple of months to as much as 9-10 months. It depends on when they also fill and where they're getting their water from. But that's a key piece is they are temporary. If you could go ahead and flip for me, that would be great. They're very diverse on the landscape. For example, there's a man-made farm pond was created, so they can be anthropogenic, but it doesn't hold water long enough to support fish. So consequently, it's been colonized by a variety of insects and amphibians that are making use of that and are able to breed in that. It could be a floodplain pool along, for example, the Connecticut River, along a river wetland, that recharges from flooding, and you get breeding leopard frogs and a variety of species using that. It could be a depression, even a small depression in an agricultural area, a cornfield. In fact, one of our vernal pool species, the spadefoot toad, or rarest, that's an endangered species up here in the north, they pretty much utilize those very temporary wetlands that hold water for a very short period of time, often in agricultural settings like that. It can be a depression within another wetland or watercourse, and that can be very common. For example, 64% of the pools that we analyzed in Andover as part of our work, we found were actually associated with another wetland. They were either embedded within a larger red maple swamp or a part of a watercourse system. So very often, you can have systems that will have an embedded vernal pool or vernal pool portions that are deeper where they're functioning as vernal pools. Go ahead and flip.
Hank, is that a cryptic vernal pool?
Those are called, yes, I think Dr. Michael Clemens, they call them cryptic pools because they're embedded in those wetland systems. So unless you identify where the egg masses are and where the breeding is occurring. But generally they're easier to catch because they're caught in the wetland rubric because of the larger swamp system. But it's usually important to identify where within those pools there's breeding going. Indicators can be a little bit of a challenge. The best one is there's no fish. Now, doesn't mean, and as you all know, I'm sure, nature is not black and white. There's a lot of variability. So for example, if you get a year where there's a lot of flooding and you have pools that are near a river and it's flooding into it, you can get fish in those pools. And I've seen that very commonly. But that doesn't mean you necessarily have permanent fish populations. So that's the key, is they permanently can't support fish populations. Flip. Typically, vernal pools do not have lots of aquatic emergent vegetation. That's more of a pond system that indicates a permanent wetland. They're shallower. They generally have an absence of bullfrogs or green frogs. Those are frogs that their larval stage require multiple years to develop. So unlike the temporary wetlands of vernal pools where a wood frog goes in, lays its eggs in the pool, they hatch, the tadpoles develop, and then metamorph out in that same year in a matter of months. With a green frog or a bullfrog, it can take them 1 or more years to develop. So they need a permanent water body. That doesn't mean, again, notice I put typically, 24% of the vernal pools that we analyzed in Andover as part of our survey, and there were 180 some pools, we found green frog tadpoles in because it was a wet year the year before, and some green frogs took that opportunity to breed within those pools. Doesn't mean they're going to successfully get out of that pool. Depends on how long the pool holds water, or that they'll breed again in that pool. but they wanted to try a colonizing event, so we found some in some of those pools. So you occasionally can, typically not bullfrogs though. So generally, species that are associated with ponds, you tend not to see within vernal pool systems. The challenge with identification isn't so much when the pools hold water, which can be a challenge for regulation, because they're easy to miss, is when they're dry. Then it becomes a little trickier, especially if you're looking in the winter and there's snow cover, that can be very difficult. However, if there's not snow cover in the fall and the winter and the pool does not have water, and by the way, most of our pools, even though we call them vernal pools, because they hold water in the spring, the majority of them actually fill in the fall. That's when they start to fill and recharge, and then they hold water throughout the winter into that spring, and then they dry up at various times during the summer. But the dry indicators you can look for actually biological remnants like the shells of fingernail clams. If you muck about in the leaf litter there, you can often find they're about the size of your fingernail. You can find caddisfly cases in some of in the pool bed. Sphagnum moss is often an indicator of higher water retention around some of these pools. You can look at the unvegetated basin, indicating that it holds water for a period of time that limits vegetative growth. Notice the moss and the rings around the trees where the water levels would be. So you can find some indicators, but it won't tell you so much about the hydrology or what's breeding in there. It'll give you an idea that this may be functioning as a vernal pool. By the way, vernal pools, even though we consider them, we tend to look at them based on the biota, what's in them, especially the amphibians. Legally in Connecticut, the biota does not really define them. In Connecticut, they're legally a water course. Because if you look at the state regulations, they're a water course, vernal and otherwise. So that's where they show up. So they're holding water on the vernal. So you don't necessarily, and this is a big misconception on the ways, you don't necessarily have to say, okay, I need to find a spotted salamander to be regulating or look at this. It can be if it's a vernal water course, it's holding water in the spring. That's within the legal definition of water courses and vernal.
So is the soil type like a peat or a muck?
Soils in Connecticut, we typically legally define
Yeah.
wetlands by soils. This is why it's a water course, because they're more difficult to determine based on soils, because depending on how long they hold water, they may not develop the modeling that you would typically see.
Okay,
I would say most vernal pools in the deeper basins would show modeling. But around the periphery,
yeah.
you wouldn't be able, that's where it gets dicey. And the periphery is important for the amphibian. So if you're doing your cores and you're trying to define the boundary based on soils, it becomes harder with vernal pools because you may not show the inundation period. So that's one of the reasons they're really a water course.
Yeah.
So it's a little different. But you can find evidence looking at some of these dry ones.
How would you find a water line on a tree?
You basically, I mean, you go out and you look, you usually see a little bit like a white line. You can see some of the white lines above where the moss is. Those generally represent the water lines. If it holds water for a longer period of time, you'll tend to see them more evident. And usually, like anything, what I tell folks, anything in nature or anything you're trying to, and this goes for anything, if you're trying to make an assessment of it, don't base it on one thing. Look at multiple things. Look through the leaf litter. Do I see any biological evidence? Do I see anything that would indicate that this holds water? Do I see moss? Do I see vegetation that's more of a wetland type of vegetation, sedges, things like that? Do I see potential water lines on the trees? Not just one, which could be an artifact, but do I see it? If I see it on one, do I see it consistently on multiple ones? Use that logical thinking of multiple things. Think about like building a case. That's the way to approach it. If you're looking at it like this, because what you're trying to do is develop a weight of evidence to say, yeah, this could be a vernal pool. And where that becomes important is, if there's an application, generally in the regulatory realm, if you're catching it outside of the breeding season, then it becomes harder to really, make determinations, and you really have to look closely. But if you want to determine whether it's being used for breeding by amphibians, you really need to look at it during the active season.
Okay, how does that relate to the federal definition that keeps getting changed for what a water course is?
The problem, definitions drive me nuts because they're variable. if you look at the definition of vernal pools for the states, and Connecticut actually took a stab at it at one time. I was on the committee, this goes back into like the eighties. And they had, and this was launched by the state, and they actually put out a publication. Most people have probably never seen it. And the goal of it was to define a vernal pool, and we never got anywhere with it. And because it gets to the point where, and there's such variability with them where it becomes challenging. And, so what, I kind of like the way we have it in Connecticut. It's a water course. It's not defined by a particular biota. It's, you've got some flexibility there to really look at it. Because the reality of it is that there's so much variability. It's hard to really box it in. And as soon as you start doing that, and it's the same with when we use distances. Oh, we need 500 feet or 750 feet, 300 feet. As you'll see, we need to think about that differently. Or, at least I'm going to promote, we need to think about that differently. Okay.
I had the dirty secret is like, well, they don't really exist. But we all kind of know what they are, but like the classification schemes for wetlands, like the Colorado U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service one and the hydrogeomorphic one, like what we call vernal pools, like you showed before, they actually fit in a lot of those different categories. And so, but like the legal definitions, like New York or Maine have, those are for their purposes, they work, but our scientists have struggled to. That's whatever is fashionable today.
Yeah, you have the ecological, you have the legal, you have these realms of, and to me, I try not to get caught up in all of that because it's more about, if they're there, what do we do with them? How do we, it's more about the conservation. And I think we need to change and by the way, one of the things that we're talking about it earlier than I wanted to, but I think we have to stop thinking about it just as vernal pools. It's really vernal pool forest ecosystem because they're really part of the forest ecosystem. And we can't divorce the two. And I don't think we should be using the word vernal pool separately from vernal pool forest ecosystem because the vernal pool depends on the forest input for nutrients. The forest nutrients come back into that forest ecosystem. Those organisms live within that forest ecosystem. Really, only the fairy shrimp is the only one that really relies on just that temporary wetland and not needing, the other sort of characteristics of it. So I think we have to think about it differently. So when people are thinking about vernal pool protection, I'm thinking about it as forest protection. Which to me changes the, because if you're protecting vernal pools, you're protecting forests. If you're protecting forests, you're protecting vernal pools. So then the question is, how do we do that? How do we best do it? Okay.
Not to belabor this, but I think.
We're gonna be here all night.
Yeah, sorry, no. But as you explained, a water course is protected under Connecticut state law, the inland wetlands and water course. But Margaret, were you asking about because they're not connected to a navigable water? Are they even protected under federal law anymore? And I think is the question.
Well,
right?
And I don't know what the latest status of the federal thing is. I tend to just ignore the federal thing. The problem with it is that again, it changes and it doesn't fall within, and it's really Connecticut, in a state like Connecticut, that's really what's driving a lot of, all of our decisions are being made at the local level through inland wetlands commissions. That's where the vernal pool impacts are being, dealt with, is at the local level. It's really not with federal projects. You can catch it on either stormwater things with state projects, especially if there's state funding associated with it, or if it's a larger and you've got Army Corps, they need an Army Corps permit. And you'll see some of the Army Corps documents I have in here, but the majority of what we're talking about really is at the local level. That's where they're being decided at the local level through inland wetland commissions.
Besides forest protection, vernal pools, animal protection, that is, they have supply of water and possible plants around the water that they
protection of vernal pools, like protection of other wetlands or water courses, protects a variety of things. It protects wildlife, it protects flooding, helps with flooding. And there's actually some interesting research that's come out that talks about the importance of some of these, what were not considered these isolated wetlands, like vernal pools. How much do they contribute to really preventing flooding or, absorbing water, during events. And it can be fairly significant. Nutrients cycling, there's a variety of values that they provide. So it's not just about the animals, or it's not just about the pool itself. There's a greater value associated with them, to the environment, including to, balancing some of the challenges that we have with climate change and other, development that occurs on the landscape. They help buffer some of the potential physical impacts. Because they are in the Northeast. I mean, if you look at vernal pools in California, there are very different animals. In the Northeast, we tend to be fairly rich in vernal pools because of our glacial history. So there's like I said, we have 180 vernal pools in Andover. Andover is a pretty small town. They tend to be distributed, and you'll see is also variable depending on where you are in Connecticut, as you'll see in the slide. So about that, so to talk a little bit more about the hydro period there, which is time it holds water, that makes a big deal. So we talked a little bit about they're diverse on the landscape. They show up in different ways. Depending on how long they hold water is critical. So I just threw together a quick slide to show you for the amphibians. For spadefoot, they'll breed anytime between March and September in Connecticut, and that pool can hold water less than 2 months, and they can get out because their eggs hatch quick and their larvae develop quick. And it can be significantly less than 2 months. It can be about a month. They can actually transform from an egg to a small little toadlet. So they're using a very ephemeral pool. They're adapted to basically no other things in that. Very, we want it all to ourselves type of thing. We don't want any competitors. We don't want any predators. This downside of that is there's not a lot of pools that do that, and you're running the risk of, breeding in a roadside ditch that dries up too quick. And so therefore they tend to have a strange breeding cycle. Many of our salamanders, the spotted salamander, Jefferson salamander, and blue spotted salamander, they're breeding in March and April. That's generally their breeding season. With the Jefferson, we can actually get them in. Now we see them starting as early as the end of February. Generally, the pools need to hold water for at least 5 months. Some could get by in 4 months on a good year, but really, generally, they need to hold water until at least mid-July, and I would argue in the case of the spotted salamander, late July, for them and, at least some of them to get out. That doesn't mean in pools that hold water longer, you won't find larvae, and you will. If we were dipping that pools today, I could probably find these spotted salamander larvae getting ready to transform right through August. Many years they may not make it. If the pool dried out this year, they might. Wood frog, a little bit more explosive breeder, quicker. They can get out in 4 months. Sometimes a little less, depending on when depending on, the particular pool, how much sunlight's coming in, the competition that year, very variable. And this can vary year by year on how long it takes them, depending on a variety of factors. It's very complicated. But generally, that's the minimum of what they need. And then the marbled salamander, it requires, because it breeds in the fall, the males will start going to the pools the end of this month. And they breed in the fall. So they need pools that fill up in the fall and hold water throughout the winter into generally May or June. To the end of May, sometimes even mid-June, late June. So they require a longer, so their strategy is it's too crowded in the spring, we're going to breed in the fall. But the downside of that is if the pools don't charge, because they're laying their eggs in dry pools, if the pool doesn't charge, they don't make it. One thing that's kind of interesting that we're starting to see is as we get these extreme events, what happens when the pools don't dry and they're already filled in the summer and they go to a completely full pool. These are the dilemmas that we're trying to see what's happening with these populations as they're responding to some of these changes. So hydro period, the duration of water within the pool throughout the season has an enormous impact on what species can effectively use it. And again, it varies year by year, but over the long haul, these animals are designed to be able to withstand years where they have no successful recruitment. Next year they try again, as you'll see, okay?
These ones that go over the winter, they can withstand ice
The marbled salamanders, yes.
Oh.
Yeah, now, if it freezes completely through, maybe not. So again, that's the factor. And as our temperatures warm in the winter, do we get more survivorship? Mark Urban at University of Connecticut would say, yeah, that may be happening. But then again, if they're struggling to breed in more filled pools than they can effectively breed, which some research shows, and some of the evidence we have from Andover shows, that, well, what balance? We don't know. Those are the uncertainties that we're facing right now. So generally, when we think of the biota of amphibians for the pools and one crustacean there, we have what are called obligate species, which means they require vernal pools. They need them. Doesn't mean they won't try to breed in some other areas, but they really require them to support populations. So the wood frog, the eastern spadefoot, blue spotted salamander, marbled salamander, Jefferson salamander, spotted salamander are the amphibians that are considered pretty much in most of the Northeast Connecticut and North, the obligate species. And then we have the fairy shrimp, and I believe there's 2 species of fairy shrimp that occur. The blue spotted and Jefferson salamander also hybridize. If you go back to the early 80s, when I was first started doing some of the field work, they were considered 4 separate species. You can see books that'll have them as the silvery salamander, trembly salamander, Jefferson salamander, and blue spotted salamander. We now know that the silvery salamander and trembly salamander were just genetic combinations of the blue spotted and the Jefferson salamander. It's literally evolution happening in our backyards here in Connecticut. We're right in a major zone of it. There's literature this thick on it. It's complicated, but it's cool. And one of the reasons why some of the vernal pools within the Northeast are pretty important. But those are the species that we generally consider to be obligate breeders. If you see evidence of them, you generally have what's considered a type of vernal pool. Not all vernal pools necessarily need to have those, remember, by our watercourse definition. Okay? But there's also other species called facultative. Just like with plants, there's wetland facultative and wetland obligates. Well, there's facultatives, means they don't require a vernal pool. They'll often use them, but doesn't mean they require them. There are a host more than this. Gray tree frogs, you name it, variety of spring peepers. The reason I highlighted these are because the four-toed salamander, which right now appears to be fairly widespread, especially in eastern Connecticut, it generally requires pools that have sphagnum moss because the females deposit their eggs in the sphagnum moss, they guard them, and then when the larva hatch, they drop into the water. And several females will generally be in the same nest. They'll have some communal nests. But climate change modeling shows that there could be a significant impact in the Northeast on the sphagnum moss habitat and on the habitat associated with them. And that's a species that right now, while widespread, may, based on modeling, become one that we need to watch and will decline. So it's one that it may be worth starting to collect data on now, like with some of our stream salamanders that we tend to sort of not consider as strongly. We need to think about them before they start to get into trouble and start to see what we have. So that's one of the reasons I highlighted that one, because they can commonly be found in certain types of vernal pools that often have the other obligate species. And the other 2 I highlighted because of the area that you're in the lower Connecticut River. We have 2 leopard frogs in Connecticut. We have the northern leopard frog. And then the Atlantic coast leopard frog wasn't discovered until 2012, 13, 14, somewhere in there. Discovered in the urban areas of New York, believe it or not. We have Connecticut populations. We are, I believe, have the only populations where they co-occur, but we've lost close to half of our populations that we had historically. We were able to actually go back and look at museum specimens and identify them, some of the ones that were collected years ago. But they're ones that are associated with the Connecticut River very closely, and they breed within those floodplain pools and wet meadows associated with those. So within your area of the lower Connecticut River, those species are possible. Right now, however, we believe the northern leopard frog may be extirpated in the lower Connecticut River.
Oh.
The last ones found were at Haddam Meadows back in the 80s. I remember seeing them there. Several other researchers, and we have not seen them since. We've searched like crazy. One of my colleagues and I heard the call of one frog in Salmon Cove 3 years ago. We were never able to find any frogs. We're pretty sure it was a leopard frog. They have a pretty distinct call. So whether that one came down, whether it's a remnant population, we don't know. Still possible that they're within some of those. So being within the capture zone of them, it's worth knowing that some of those areas, those meadow areas along the Connecticut River and some of those lower tributaries like the Salmon River and so forth, you may have leopard and you may have Atlantic coast leopard frog. I mean, we don't know. You know, they're more widespread in the northern part of the Connecticut River Valley, north of Middletown. And as you know, I mean, the river changes drastically between the two. You have much more floodplain habitat north of Middletown, where it doesn't cut through the sort of the uplands and the rocky habitat, where it's more of that glacial, the old glacial lake plain where we're there. But it's worth in your area keeping that in mind, because there could be areas, and those areas that are associated with floodplain pools may have that contingent associated with them, or may in the future be able to recolonize with them. So who knows?
Any thought on why?
We've noodled that. We have not a clue. We have not a clue. We really don't know. And at the same time that they seem to blink out in Connecticut, they did the same thing in Rhode Island. And I think right now in Rhode Island, they only have a couple of populations, but all the populations that Chris Rathel and Michael Clements found, I think all of them but one might have been extirpated. So we don't know. And then, of course, there is a reptile too that's very much associated with vernal pools, and that's the spotted turtle. Spotted turtle is a regional conservation concern. It is under review right now by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for potential listing. I do not believe it will be listed because I think it's still relatively too abundant. But in the lower Connecticut, but the idea is to keep it there, not to get to the point where we have to list it. And being in the lower Connecticut River area, you have some robust population. So it's another species associated with vernal pools that is worth conservation consideration, and is one that is of a high regional priority. And they're what we consider to be a landscape animal. The vernal pool is the bee. This is actually a rendering of an area, the Higbee Mountain area that we did for the book we wrote. And just to illustrate how the spotted turtle uses that landscape seasonally, moving from where it overwinters in the shrub swamp to go into the vernal pool in the spring to feed heavily on the amphibians that are breeding there and the insects. Depending on how long that pool holds water, it could stay there or not. Then it will move off, sometimes go back to the shrub swamp. It will generally go into, it may estivate on a hot year in the forest. The females will nest in open sandy areas. So they're moving across that landscape. So from a conservation standpoint, when one thinks of spotted turtles, one has to think not of just the vernal pool, one has to think of that whole landscape and how do we maintain, an effective conservation plan for that landscape. That becomes challenging. So they're a large landscape animal. The vernal pool animals are landscape animals as well, but not as widely spread out on that landscape. They're using, generally the forest and the pool and the forest, and then connecting to some other pools, as you'll see.
Do the native beaver population have any impact on vernal pools?
Yes, not so much on vernal pools. I mean, they can to some extent if they're associated with the watercourse. Or on the floodplains. They can be very beneficial to things like newts and spotted salamanders will colonize the sites. Very frequently, you'll see if beaver come in and flood out an area, very quickly the imponded area will be colonized by wood frogs and spotted salamanders. When they blow down, when that beaver dam goes out, obviously it's no longer suitable for them. The populations that are associated with that either breed elsewhere or they don't make it, but you'll see there's a rationale for that in their ecology. Same with the spotted turtle. I mean, the beaver impoundments create very good spotted turtle habitat, variety of other reptile and amphibian habitat. But again, it's one of those things that it helps create a habitat. It's a temporary habitat. So those what we call early successional habitats that are dynamic, and the floodplains along rivers is the same thing. Part of the problem we have is that we've actually lost some of those natural processes we've either really downplayed, like fire, beaver, even we've managed beaver to a large extent, especially in our suburban areas. I mean, some of the flooding along the normal flooding that would occur and meandering of rivers, which has impacts, long-term impacts on populations. These animals can adjust to those on intact landscapes. It's when we fragment the landscapes and they can't adjust to those, that's when it becomes a problem. So yes, it can have an impact on that, but it could be, but it's generally a temporary impact. And depending on how fragmented and compromised that habitat is, it would, probably would be of no consequence to them. Okay, so I mentioned, so that's the basics of vernal pools. But as I mentioned, we really need to think about them as part of the forest because they are entwined within the forest ecosystem. They're really a part of that system. They're not divorced from that. They get their energy from leaf litter that falls in and branches. It's not from, photosynthesis of plants like you get in a pond system. It's very similar to streams, the woodland streams that are getting it from all the leaf litter coming in and then all the macroinvertebrate stuff that Lisa and I know really well. All those macroinvertebrates that churn it all up and then, break it down, the detritivores and all that sort of stuff. And then the predators that feed off those. Vernal pools are very similar to that from a nutrient cycling perspective. Next slide. And the way that works is I'll give you two examples. The wood frog, they reside in the forests. They in the spring, they come out of hibernation. They lay large rafts of egg masses. That's what a single mass looks like. That's what a raft of wood frog egg masses look like in the pool. They hatch out into a tadpole. That's one that's transforming. Tadpole turns into a little froglet that looks like that guy there, only he's tiny. And then the cycle starts again. So they're using the vernal pool really just to deposit those eggs and development of their young, and then they're out. Next slide, please. And the spotted salamander does the same thing. The Jeffersons and the blue spotted, same as the wood frog. Slightly different timing, but same thing. The marbled salamander, on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, here you can see a female with eggs. Those are pointing to the eggs. They come in the fall, and then they do the same thing. Then when that pool fills with water, generally with those September, October rains, it would fill with water, and then they basically hatch. They grow over the winter. The pool holds water, doesn't completely freeze. They will, that larva will be large come spring. What do you think that larva feeds on in the spring? All those little other wood frogs that are hatching out and all the other insects and stuff like that are hatching out of all the spring breeders. So that's their ecological strategy is a little different, but every strategy has its risks, whether it's spring or fall. So there's two cycles, but in both cases, the adult animals and when they metamorphose, they live in the forests. They live in those woodlands. That's where they're going. And the nutrients are moving back and forth between them. And there's a lot of nutrients coming out of those pools from those salamander larvae that transform, that have come back out. All those leaves that are decaying and the insects are breaking down, that nutrient is cycling back from the insects and the amphibians back into the forest. They're very much tied to it. Next slide. But there's something that's a pool unto itself because it's dynamic. Okay. And it's very variable. You can get, multi-years where you don't get a lot of productivity and all of a sudden the wood frog population crashes. Wood frogs live about 2.5 years on average. So it crashes. So does the population die out? No. Why? Because of what we call metapopulations. When we look at a landscape, these animals they'll attempt to colonize new sites. Approximately 20% of the young wood frogs that come out of that pool will attempt to colonize a new site. And it varies by year and by species, and some are better colonizers than others. Wood frogs are very good at it. Very good. Forestry road, ditch, I guarantee you, it's got water in the spring, you're gonna find some wood frog egg masses and some spotted salamander egg masses. They're attempting to colonize. Here's a spot nobody else is using. I'm gonna take advantage of this. Comes with a cost. If it dries up, you lose everything. If it doesn't, you don't have the competition. You probably don't have the predators because it's brand new and all of that. Your young might make it. So what happens is these animals can live in populations that are really not just a pool. They're the population on the landscape. You may have a pool that is very productive because it's deeper and in most years holds water, so it's the source. And it's important, but all the eggs in one basket is a problem. So they're really using that whole landscape, and they're connected genetically to that whole landscape and other pools. That becomes important in conservation, as you'll see. Next slide. So just to give you an example, this is based on, if anybody wanted the actual citations, I could give you multiple studies that have looked at various throughout the Northeast that have tracked these animals and how far they're dispersing as juveniles and adults. Very variable by site, depending on the quality of the habitat, very variable by the species, but in general, the core habitat around the vernal pool is around 1,000 feet. So within 1,000 feet of a pool is really critical core habitat for them. That's where the animals are really using. Okay, the closer in, but within 500 feet, really critical. I mean, 100 feet around the pool, absolutely critical because they're stacking up there. It's a transition zone. But 1,000 feet is sort of core. Adults can disperse a mile or more. So they're using the landscape. They may colonize, they may try, so they may be genetically connected a mile or more. Juvenile dispersal, half a mile or more. So they're connecting across that landscape. Genetic neighborhood, when they've done genetic studies, there have been several done in Connecticut. Up to 6.5 miles, genetic connections. And it depends on the population. So for example, marbled salamanders tend to be less connected across the landscape than say wood frogs or spotted salamanders. So there's some variability, but in most of these vernal pool species, they're functioning as a population on a larger landscape, really as a metapopulation, okay? Next slide. This is an example from Andover. So this is Nathan Hale State Forest, and that's about just shy of a mile stretch of 10 vernal pools where we were collecting data on. And just to give you an example of that, to show you, of those 10 pools, I pulled the data, there were a total of 3,025. It's actually more than that because some of the egg masses, we couldn't even count the full number, but over 3,025 wood frog egg masses, and 244 spotted salamander egg masses spread among those pools. And it ranged anywhere from, pools that had 700 some, the pools only had 35. The wood frogs bred in all but one pool. Spotted salamanders bred in all but 2 pools. The 2 pools didn't hold water long enough for them to breed. The one pool, the wood frog didn't breed in. Interestingly, a spotted salamander tried to breed in. We had found 2 egg masses. It was a colonizing attempt that won't be successful. And then marbled salamanders only bred in 2 pools. That's it. So when we think of vernal pool conservation, when we look at each pool, really, we have to look at that whole landscape. We have to look at that and say, it's different. And it doesn't mean that marbled salamanders won't colonize some of those sites. And in fact, we might have missed them because the year before was a very wet year. And one of those years where I think, because there were sites where I knew we had spotted salamanders, where the year we did our survey, we did not detect our marbled salamanders. We did not detect marbled salamanders, even though I know they breed in those pools. And I think that was because they didn't effectively breed or are bred in low density, so we didn't detect them because of the wet fall the previous year. So you would have to look at these over multiple years to really get an idea of, what's going on. But you don't, as you'll see, you can gather information that can guide you as to how do I prioritize and how do I put this together. But that gives you an example of the vernal pool forest ecosystem there is dependent on that block, not just an individual pool. And they are likely all talking to one another. They're genetically likely all connected, and they can colonize. If one of those pools, for whatever reason, has 4 years in a row where it dries up and the wood frogs die out, I guarantee you it would be recolonized. Or if somebody goes in and does a forestry operation and they take out some, reduce the population, it will rebound. It has the opportunity to rebound. It's when that gets so highly fragmented that they can't. It's the problem. Ed?
So that miracle that's taking place there in that valley or that area, there's no development there.
It's a state forest.
It's state forest.
Yeah.
Have you looked into situations where there's some development?
Yep.
And the developer is sensitive to this and
Yeah.
has provided
Yeah.
for the saving of,
There's ways you can take that landscape I showed you and do development within that footprint, within that block that would help preserve that diversity and those populations.
and they would have that
Good.
meta
Well-
population.
As long as you consider that within your planning of the location of roads, the location of houses, or whatever, depending on what type of development you're doing there. You know, the distance from them, you know, you would identify is there, for example, when I mentioned some of those smaller hydro period pools versus the very productive one. You know, you can really look at it and say, okay, we want a really good buffer around this one. We're a little less concerned about this one. And it's how you do it, making sure that as you're going in and doing a project in there. So for example, if you were doing forestry in there, you would want to make sure you smoothed out any ruts. You would want to make sure you did it off season. There's ways to do it once you know what's there. And once you have a sense of how to maintain connectivity and forest cover, what do I need for forest cover? Where does it need to be? Are there other wetlands there that are important that they need to connect to? Then you develop your site plan. What problem we have is that usually comes after the fact, after somebody develops the site plan, when the clock is running in a regulatory process. A pre-planning approach where you come at where if you know this is why we're mapping it. So we know this, so if somebody comes in with a subdivision proposal, we can go, oh, okay. Well, let's work on this. Let's see how we can, you know, so that's how that's why having the information up front allows you to figure out how to do the balancing of the development with the vernal pools. There's going to be some cases where it won't work. And then there's going to be cases where it's real simple. I mean, I've worked with developers who, you know, basically did development that was really more streetscape and preserved the whole block except for the front end of it. I mean, so it depends on the project, but we do know the impacts also when you don't do it well.
I hope you have an opportunity to do this presentation at the upcoming in the spring of the Connecticut Land Conservation
You were
Commission.
there last year. I went to your presentation.
That was Cacuit. That was Connecticut Association.
I know I saw you talk
Yeah.
one day.
Yeah,
Because right now they sent out emails looking for presentations and you have such an important message here.
I'd be happy to present it. I mean, I'm all about getting the message out because we don't, as you'll see, I mean, we wrote a whole book about why this isn't working. And the whole reason we wrote this book, because this book was actually finished in 1993, bless you. When Michael Clemens, you know, did a book on the amphibians and reptiles of Connecticut. So we knew about that. But as we continued to do work over 25 years, we said, we're losing ground. We're losing ground. So we said, we have to do something. And so that's why I do this. Even though I'm retired, is we have to do it different. If we don't, we're going to continue to see the declines. And I would argue that we know enough of what we need to do where, and the tools are there to be able to do it. The problem is, and we were having this discussion earlier, is you don't want to get lost in the process. You don't want to put all your energy in the process of doing the mapping and everything and not in actually implementing it. Because that's where the challenge is how do we actually take this and do what you just basically suggested? Okay, we have this, now how do we make it work when somebody comes in? Or how do we change the process so it's not frustrating to the developer when he comes in and has got all his money or has figured out that this is how I'm gonna do it, but now we're saying, okay, well, we have to do it. How do we make sure the process recognizes? We'll go ahead of ourselves. So there's one other thing you need to I think you need to understand, okay? This is Connecticut. Hopefully everybody recognizes it. This is a physiographic map of Connecticut. You guys are down, you can see where the Connecticut River Valley is, and you guys cut through it, so it's no longer valley anymore. We're down along there, you know, more close to the coast. But, you know, it jumps out at you that Connecticut is fairly diverse. We have this big valley that used to be a glacial lake, Glacial Lake Hitchcock. We have those funky little fingers of ridge, high elevation, which are the old lava flows, the basalt ridges that run right up, you know, Meriden Mountain and if you're in Berlin, you've Lamentation Mountain we were talking about, that's on that. We have the high uplands, but look at all the valleys in there. And when we look at that, it's all actually underneath, it's all calcareous, all limestone. We have a coast, but it's a narrow coast. And it's not a sandy coast, it's a rocky but a narrow coast, but it's an estuary. We have incredible estuarine habitat. And then we have, these more gently rolling, less higher elevation eastern hills and southwestern hills. If you flip to the next slide, please. So if you look at that and you look at some geology and some of the elevation, you can actually come up with ecoregions for Connecticut. And I would proffer that if you want to look at diversity in Connecticut, all you need to do is understand our ecoregions. And I don't care whether it's plants or animals, because they're driven by the geological changes that have occurred. They're driven by the climate changes associated with the different elevational changes within these ecoregions. They're driven by some of the geology of the soils, the landscape there, whether it's basalt ridges or whether it's calcareous wetlands. You really see differences. I've highlighted in circle the approximate area of your catchment. Okay, that's sort of the area of your responsibility. So when I think of your area of responsibility, I look at this. I'm going to get up now, move around. When I think about this, you guys are in the lower Connecticut River, so you have a really big responsibility for the Connecticut River ecosystem, which is very different than the Connecticut River ecosystem up here. Very different characteristic and quality of it. Okay, you have and I know you guys take that one very, very seriously. I know that. And all the way to the mouth. But you also have on your periphery basalt ridge areas, which are entirely different than this other area. They're going to have a biodiversity that is entirely different than here. There'll be some commonalities, but they're very different. You can find Jefferson salamanders, but you're not going to find them anywhere in here. You can find blue spotted salamanders, you're not going to find them anywhere in here. You can find those leopard frogs, if they're still occur, you're not going to find them here, you can find them here. Maybe along here. But so you're going to have differences. Colchester, you've got some interesting stuff going on, glacial lake plain there too. There may be some interesting associations of plants or animals there. Down here in Essex, where you are, another area. Some of these areas may already be developed, because that's the other thing that we'll talk about in a minute. But understanding your ecoregions, where are we, has an influence on, and not only on the organisms, but the type of pools. For example, if I were to show you a map, we did this actually with 7 towns. We mapped vernal pools in Suffield and a number of towns in the Farmington River Valley. The numbers of vernal pools, I think we had 680 some in Suffield, primarily in that part of Suffield where the glacial lakes were. All those pingo potholes and kettle holes, simply because of the geology there. If you're on the basalt ridge, they're perched pools on top of the ridges, very unique pools. And then you get different ones on the base associated with swamps. They're very different than the pools you're going to find here associated with your forests and the drainages. So understanding the differences in your region and how that reflects on those natural resources, the types of pools that might be there, the species composition, and this goes, by the way, not just for amphibians and reptiles, but you can use this thinking for a variety of other species. It allows you to start thinking, how do we prioritize? If I were developing a conservation plan for the region, I'd look carefully at these areas because these are going to be unique areas. Obviously, you've got a unique area here. I mean, you want to look at what are some of the areas that we need to be, if we want to preserve biodiversity within our region, how do we do that? If you only preserve pools in here, you will miss a whole suite of unique assets and resources over in this region. So understanding that also could guide how you manage and how you look at conservation initiatives within particular regions, even within your area. So this is a good example of how Connecticut, even though we're a small state, we're very diverse. Out where I am in Andover, it's pretty boring. It was pretty easy. Look, there's nothing. I mean, it's just a basic, forests and wetlands and stuff like that. No really critical features that we have, like in, the purple up there with the calcareous wetlands, or all the glacial lake plain or the ridges and so forth. I mean, it's a little bit easier for us because we don't have to consider some of those. A little bit more boring if we're surveying them. So I wanted you to understand a little bit about that because it plays into, but as I would argue, even though we tend to do things at a town level, a municipal level, I tend to think we also have a greater responsibility as stewards of the land. And one of the responsibilities of towns that have basalt ridges is to preserve those basalt ridges, consider them in the land use planning. If you're up in Northwest Connecticut, you don't have to worry about basalt ridges, but you should be worrying about your calcareous wetlands and your calcareous habitats. And your upland high elevation habitats, your ridges and so forth. So there are certain things that I think we all have responsibilities for depending on where we are in Connecticut, in addition to what we're trying to do within our town or within our smaller regions. Okay, so before we move on to conservation challenges, actually, could you back up one? I don't want you to read that yet. So I wanted to summarize real quickly, all right? So before we talk about the conservation piece. A couple things I wanted to make sure that were sort of key messages for takeaway. One is vernal pools are temporary water courses with highly variable landscape settings and highly variable hydro periods. In other words, the duration that they hold water. So that's important to know, all right? They're temporary, but the duration is variable. And that hydro period greatly influences the diversity. So when we think about planning for vernal pools, we have to think about the diversity of hydro periods, not think about all vernal pools as the same, but think about how do I preserve a variety of hydro periods. Vernal pools are inextricably linked to the forest ecosystem with many amphibians functioning on a metapopulation level. So we need to think not about the vernal pools separately, but about the vernal pools and forest. This is forest conservation as much as it is vernal pool conservation. It really is. And it's not just about the amphibians, it's about nutrient cycling into the forest. It's about flood, storage of waters and pure. It's all of those values that we assign to wetlands and so forth, but we have to think about it as associated with the forest as much as with the vernal pool. And the metapopulation piece ties in that forest because the animals are using that larger connectivity. And then the last one is Connecticut has a diversity of ecoregions, which are based on differences associated with geology, climate, and topography, and distribution of species. And that goes for not just amphibians or reptiles, but distribution of species and the pool settings or geomorphology, where you will find pools and the characteristics of those pools and their hydrology often varies within those regions. And I gave you several examples. The different types of pools on the ridges and the base of the basalt ridges, the pools in the kettle holes up in Suffield and the glacial lake plain, different settings, different types of, and may require different approaches to conservation. Now we can move on. Thank you. Okay, so what are the conservation challenges? So I tried to break it down as simple as I could. I think it's a couple things. So I couch it as how do we encourage long-term protection of intact vernal pool forest ecosystems? We have to figure out how can we preserve on the long term permanently intact vernal pool forest ecosystems. Okay. Number two is how do we encourage residential and commercial development that maintains ecological connectivity? Your point earlier of are you looking at this where there's development? Because it's already developed in many cases, and we're going to be developing more. The question is where and how. Okay, so how do we do it and maintaining ecological integrity? The third challenge is how do we encourage land use practices, forestry, agriculture, recreation, and mining? And when I mean mining, I mean sand gravel excavation and quarrying. Those are still occurring in Connecticut. Okay, so those are things that are still occurring in Connecticut that have impacts beyond development. Okay, so how do we encourage those practices that avoid or significantly mitigate impacts? Okay, these are the challenge. So those are the three. If I were to say, what are our three top challenges with vernal pools? It's those things. How do we do those things? In recognition, we need to recognize a few things though that get to the urgency of this. One of them is climate change is acting on vernal pool and forest habitat, and it's acting on it now. We don't know there's a lot of uncertainty of what, there may be some positive impacts for some species, some negative impacts. There's a lot of uncertainty on what will balance out and what won't. You don't know. But we know it's acting on them, and it's very clear, it should be obvious to anybody that wetlands or a water course that are dependent on precipitation, temperature and things like that are likely to be heavily impacted by changes in precipitation and drought conditions and temperature and so forth. And we also need to recognize that in many places, these ecosystems are experiencing impacts associated with various land use practices. There are very few places in Connecticut that you can go where our ecosystems are not already under some level of, impact may be too harsh, but with some influences, anthropogenic influences. And I'll often have people say to me, well, yeah, well, you showed Nathan Hale State Forest. That's a perfect example. I say, oh no, they do forestry operations in Nathan Hale State Forest. Forestry operations have an impact. How great an impact, and it's an impact that can be recovered from, but how great an impact depends on my point number two. How do you, or my point number three, how do we do it without how do we do it the best we can? So most of our places in Connecticut, we have very few land that is basically completely off limits to people's uses, whether it's private individuals using them for various things, or whether it's state management operations, or whether it's town use for recreation, a variety of things. These are the challenges we face. And oftentimes we try to have multiple values associated with. I run into this in Andover. One of our biggest challenges, one of our greatest natural resource assets is the Hop River corridor, which is recognized as a significant ecosystem corridor. It's also the area recognized for economic development, the primest area for economic development between Bolton, Andover, Coventry, and Columbia, leading into Willimantic. It's the primary area for recreation. It's got the Hop River State Park Trail, and they're making more connectors to it. So you've got, it's primary area for commercial development that's going in there. The town maintenance garages and so forth. So you have competing, all worthy things, by the way, but competing interests around the resource. So the trick is it's already showing the impacts of those. How do we mitigate some of those? How do we prevent additional ones? Those are the challenges, which is why we sort of map all this stuff. Okay, so that's sort of my take on the challenges and what we need to recognize. Okay. This is one of my favorite maps. This was developed for wildfires, and they've done it for every state in the country. It's called the Wildland Urban Interface Map. And what they looked at is development that intermixes with our natural habitats and interfaces, butts up against it. So the only areas that we have where that doesn't occur are the green areas that you see. Connecticut, where do you think we stack up in the country? As far as the percentage of our land that is an interface or intermix.
I think number one.
Number one. People laugh at New Jersey.
I think it was said that Connecticut is so unique that actually there's an interface of housing in the forests.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a northeast function. Yeah, it's that suburban sort of development, and you can see it. I mean, the red is the urban, very urbanized areas. The orange is, is as you go out, the yellow is, sort of your ex-urban areas. And then the orange is more of your suburbanization. Let me take a look at the next slide. This is what it looks like. If you look at a satellite image. So this goes from pretty much the area of East Hartford, Connecticut, which is in the central Connecticut lowland, going out toward Bolton, Connecticut, which is in Eastern Highland, out toward my neck of the woods. And you can see that development. Now, if you were to look at that image in 1950, it'd be radically different. 1960, it'd be radically different. 1970, it'd be radically different. And I would dare say in 2050, it'll be radically different. So the trick is, and I guarantee it, that if you do a transect the vernal pools along that system, you'll find very different levels of impact and so forth. So that's what that WOO map, as I affectionately call it, the WOO map looks like. When you do it from the sky. That's what it looks like. And that's what our challenge is. So you have large intact areas for now, and some of those may be protected, but I would also argue that a lot of those large intact areas are still under various levels of impact, whether it's forestry, whether it's trails. And again, it's how we do this. I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things. I'm saying we have to be careful on how we do them, where we do them. And we have to recognize that our systems are not pristine. We are faced with, when we go out and we do a survey in a vernal pool, we're not looking at a system that is at its original baseline as much as they can be, because they're dynamic systems. We're not looking at the natural baseline of those. We're looking at the baseline that's already been under some level of land use impact. Think of the changes that have occurred over Connecticut over the years, the land use changes that have occurred over the years. They've had impacts. We're working on a site now that every time we go out, we just are banging our heads against, because to us, it's intact. The 300-foot zone around the stream is completely forested for a 2-mile stretch. 1,000 feet around it, there's forested areas, but there's old tobacco fields, old gravel pits that have been there. There's a railroad crossing. And we are amazed at the fact that when we look at it, we say it's intact, yet we cannot find. And we just are amazed. And we have another project over in extreme western Connecticut where we think we've seen the progression of it over a 16-year period of time. And we hope to be able to publish that. We're actually looking at, in fact, I was on a phone call earlier today where we may be able to document that with salamanders, the decline over a 16-year period of time based on progression of impacts moving north along an extensive ridge system, where we had good baseline data from salamanders from the developed end all the way up to where it was pretty much all rural and undeveloped and in town. That's changed over 16 years. And we've actually seen that. We're seeing it now. The folks that are doing the research, that are going out trying to sampling for salamanders, having a hell of a time. Having a hell of a time. Flipped 2,000 cover objects yesterday and found 1 salamander. So we're starting with, so that's what if you look at it, it looks great. But when you see the worms, the invasive vegetation, you start to, but when you drive by in a car, you say, well, or if you look at it like that, you say, well, what? It looks good. It's forested. Yeah, but it's impacted forest. That's what we're trying to avoid. So again, it's not just development, the residential, commercial, industrial development. It's some of those other activities, timber harvests, agricultural croplands, commercial solar arrays, sand and gravel operations. These all have various impacts. Some can have some positive impact. Sand and gravel sites can be great nesting sites for turtles if you account for that and don't have the operation impact the turtles. I mean, they can revert into very good habitat. So there's ways to do some of this. Same with agriculture. Some of the edges of agriculture can be important habitats. So it depends on how you do it, but they can be detrimental. You see the water in those ruts on that forest operation. If there's a vernal pool near that, they're decoys for that. And I can show you that. I see it every year. It's a common sight. I'm sure you've all seen it. Egg mass is deposited in there, decoying animals out into these pools. So these all have levels of impact on these systems, and they're occurring. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there's climate change. And you're probably all well aware of what they're projecting for our area, which we're already seeing. Warmer winters and summers, so temperature increases. Greater occurrence of summer drought conditions, so that should see more frequency of them. And an increase in extreme precipitation events. Definitely seeing a lot of that. As I mentioned, it's really uncertain what these effects will be on these various vernal pools and species. Some can be positive. For example, warmer winters could increase survivorship of larvae of marbled salamanders and allow them to colonize new sites. However, extreme precipitation events, especially if they line up in the fall, like we've seen on several years, could prevent a successful breeding of those populations. Do they balance? We don't know. Greater occurrence of summer droughts. They're actually predicting more precipitation over the winter in the form of rain in our area. Will that balance out a greater, so you get recharge pools with more water, holding water? Will that balance out increase of frequency of summer droughts? Maybe, maybe not. Or if it does, on some years and some years it doesn't, over the long haul, the net, because these animals, they're in it for the long haul. Where does it fall? There's a lot of uncertainty. We just don't know. But, you know, we should be using the precautionary principle of trying to preserve an intact landscape, let the animals figure it out. Give them the opportunity, give those ecosystems the ability to do their thing and buffer themselves and deal with these changes in conditions. And we also need to be thinking about them as we're developing our landscape, because we're not designing for these changes, we've got problems. So it's not only us that this stuff, or only them that this affects us as well.
You know, it seems to me that part of the solution is what land trusts do. We acquire property. It's not touched by anything, whether it be agriculture, solar arrays, mining. When the Berlin Land Trust acquires property, we don't allow anything to happen in that property. Because it seems to me by the time research is done to prove one way or the other, the development has already occurred. It's too late.
Too late, yeah.
Because nobody wants to wait long enough to come up with some conclusive research one way or the other.
Right.
So these commissions on a lot of towns, you can't prove it at that time, so
Right.
they allow it. If you
Well,
see
that-
my point, it's really forever wild. Don't touch it. That's it. Leave it the way it is.
Yeah, you're getting to where I'm going, but the problem is that some of the land can be preserved that way, and we need to preserve more of it as we can. But it's unrealistic to think we're gonna be, you know, we're gonna stop developing or using land.
No, I
So
don't.
it's a combination of the two. And I would argue that it's understanding where we need to really focus on prioritization of acquisition and conservation easements versus mitigation. You know, you're going to where I'm gonna go in a few minutes here. Okay? Go, next slide, please. All right, so stewardship, what does it mean? All right, so what you need to put together, if we're thinking about this, is you need to understand where you are. Again, in other words, that ecoregion perspective, where are we? You know, and what do we have? Those you have to have up front, or you're constantly gonna be chasing your tail. If you don't get those, and that to me is where the natural resource inventory process comes in, is really understanding that here's lands. And I'm not saying that you need to do surveys for all the species out there, you don't. But you need to do some mapping, you need to understand a little bit about what you have. And then use that to help be more strategic about the conservation. So let's move on. And you need to think of it on multiple scales, and this will get to roles too. There's the Connecticut regional context. So in other words, thinking about the ecoregion. So you, as I mentioned earlier, you shouldn't just be thinking about your town. You should be thinking about, well, do I have a regional commitment here or a statewide commitment? Basalt ridges, Connecticut River, coastline, calcareous. Do I have an area that really is valuable? Statewide on a regional level that we need to consider. That's the ecoregion thinking, okay? I showed you the map. Then there's the ecosystem context. In other words, looking at, when you're looking at a site, even what is the larger ecosystem? What's the block that I'm dealing with here? If you've got a project coming in that's just that parcel, even though you may not be regulating an application for those parcels, you need to understand the whole. We just did one of the projects we did, which is a big project, a big solar project. There were multiple parcels that they focused on. So when we came in, we were very clear up front. We said, oh no, we're not looking at just the parcels. We're looking at this 2 miles of this intact system, because that's the ecosystem. We defined it and said, we need to understand this system and how your parcels and the habitat associated with the parcels fits within this, because yours have an impact on this whole. And they agreed. So that's what we're in the process of doing with them. So you have to look at it. You don't have to have the individual applicant doesn't necessarily do that, but that's where your work comes in, is planning and it's setting the stage so you understand it, so that you can evaluate that at that scale, not just at the parcel scale. And so with vernal pools, you're looking at, at least a half mile, that dispersal area as part of that region. And you're looking at, is there a diversity of pools within those areas, that we need to sort of maintain connectivity or that we wanna preserve. And I highlighted refuge pools. There's a concept coming up that folks are looking at. They just did some computer modeling. They're concerned about with climate change, will pools dry out faster and species not be able to adjust to this? And the modeling they've done in the Northeast has shown that, yeah, that looks like that's going to be the case. But they found that there are pools that will hold water, even in drought times, tend to be more groundwater fed or muckier pools. I've seen that myself. And Pollock and I had a project we did in Middletown where there were 15 pools in a site. And in a dry year, we expected not to see any of them in August. And we had some pools that had larvae in them that still were holding water when everything else was completely bone dry and it had been bone dry for months. Refuge pools. In other words, because of their characteristics, they can support a population. They can help be that source so that as the other pools are impacted, they can feed those, they can help be that source to recolonize those as they become more suitable. Because those are likely, like with everything, likely not every year those pools will dry out. There'll be some years they'll be able to support and potentially have stuff, but they wouldn't be able to make it on their own, that cluster. So understanding that there's potential refuge pools can be a priority that helps maintain impacts to the greater system and feed that complex. So there's work on that, and there's been some good research done on that and some good modeling done on that. Which, by the way, if anybody wants any of that, I'd be more than happy to get you copies of some of this stuff. And then there's the vernal pool context. And this is the context that most people focus on, because this is what happens at the application. And usually and there's hundreds of guidelines out there. There's lots of them. The pool basin, then there's the 100 feet around the pool, and then there's the envelope around the pool. Is it 7 critical habitat? There's many definitions for it. Is it 500 feet? Is it 750 feet? Is it 1,000 feet? The reality of it is, if you get lost in the numeric game, you're not going to win the game. It's because it really depends on the site, the quality of the habitat, the species associated there. And by the way, that's just a picture now, because that whole system is changing. So it's dynamic. Even if we don't touch, even without human intervention, it's changing. Trees mature. You have to think of it as the bigger piece. Don't get lost in, those are good guidelines. What was it, Pirates of the Caribbean? They're just guidelines. These are just guidelines. But you do need to think of it at those sort of levels. That's what stewardship at multiple scales means, okay? All right, so I'll give you some quick examples. There's Andover, okay? Next slide. So what we did is as part of our broader natural resource inventory, which we really were the only thing we really inventoried, everything else was mapping based. We used some DEP data, which you have access to, this, the endangered species data, the NDDP data. We decided, because there's no vernal pool data, we said we're going to map our vernal pools, and then we're going to go out and we're going to see if we can confirm biological, collect biological data and habitat data. We're going to get some volunteers to train, and we're going to work on that, and then we'll quality control it. And we'll have all that information, and we'll be able to put it in planning. And we'll be able to use it for site reviews with our Inland Wetland Commission. We did it as a joint initiative with our Inland Wetland Commission and our Conservation Commission, because the Conservation Commission really is responsible for planning. The Inland Wetland Commission's charge is really regulatory. Two different sort of roles there. And then we reached out to landowners. We have various landowners. Some have participated, some did not. But we mapped, the first stage is mapping what are called potential vernal pools, because you're mapping from aerial photographs. So it could be a pond, depends on how conservative you want to be on your marker. Or it could be a pool that dries up. You can go back and forth and get some idea through the satellite images if it's a vernal pool, just on looking at several, looking at an April or image, and then looking at a July image. You can sometimes tell. So that's what it looked like in Andover. I think we mapped 180 some potential pools. Okay, next slide. So what we ended up doing is we went out and we collected data over a 1-year period of time. We did 2 surveys per pool. We basically did egg mass counts and we focused on spotted salamanders and wood frogs. We do not have Jefferson salamanders or blue spotted salamanders in our region or spadefoot toads, so we didn't have to worry about them. Marbled salamanders, I sampled for because I was concerned about disease spread, and that requires dip netting. So I just wanted to have one person doing it. I did it multiple times. I visited every pool as quality control and did duplicate egg mass counts from the volunteers. Did the habitat assessments of the pools to try to get a sense of hydro period and other characteristics associated with the pools. So we took all that information and then we put it into, there's what's called the Best Development Practices Manual that was produced by Aram Calhoun and Michael Clemens. Many towns use it and it provides guidelines for tier ranking. So the colors there are tier ranking, okay? So the blue ones are pools we did not access, we didn't have access to. Let's see if I get my tiers right here. The yellow ones, I think, were the tier 3 pools. The purple ones were the tier 2 pools, and the red ones were the tier 1 pools, if I remember right. We had a lot of high tier pools because we're pretty rural still. So we had pretty good productivity. So we took all of that information as a data layer, okay? And what we did then is we said, okay, let's overlay it and let's use some of those zones, those 100 and 750 feet and so forth, and look at, but we went beyond that. We looked at other wetlands that were in the area using the National Wetlands Inventory map, which you can access online. We used the regular wetland soils maps that are out and available to all the towns. We looked at topography, we looked at development, and we looked and said, okay, where do we have some intact areas where we want to create loosely what we would call conservation zones, where if we would try to preserve forest cover intact within these zones to maintain connectivity for all of these hydro period pools. And that's what you see. Those are the areas that are outlined. Now, we have in Andover, we've created 3 conservation corridors, what we call open space conservation corridors. One of them is the western corridor, which is the one on the bottom. The eastern corridor is the one on the top. It's the whole length of the town, basically. It jigs and jogs. And then right through the middle, that's Route 6, the white line that runs through there. Along that is the Hop River corridor. So that's a major corridor, primarily east of the Route 6. So we have separate corridor maps that would show that. So those pools follow areas that had previously been mapped before we even done it, when they did their first plan of conservation development back in 2015, when they did a rough natural resource inventory where they basically did some basic mapping, but they did a pretty good job because they caught some of the major areas. So you see what we're trying to do is preserve connectivity across that landscape. It is likely, if we had greater access along the Hop River corridor, that corridor would expand, but we don't have enough data to support it yet. So how do we use this? So there's 2 ways and this is where we're in the process of, so I can't tell you how well, I can tell you how well that worked. How well this implementation part, that's up in the air yet. So what we did is we have a wetland agent and we have a wetland commission. So what we did is we sat down with the wetland agent and we said, here's the spreadsheet of all the data. Here's the vernal pool map. So they can, now an application comes in. So this is something that doesn't have to be shared publicly, so landowners don't flip out. Wetland agent has it. He can look at that, application comes in, and he now doesn't have to rely on pool. Now for pools that we surveyed, he's got the data. So he knows what's there. He knows the relative abundance of it. He's got notes on the quality of the habitat, all of that prioritization. And he knows now connectivity in areas that we're focused on, and he can start to think about that as he's interfacing with the applicant, okay? Even before, hopefully before an application. And very importantly, when a forest application comes in, a forestry application, which tends not to need a lot of application, to start to guide that process. He's got the data. So you might say, well, what happens if there's a blue dot? He doesn't have anything. But what he has is there's a possibility of a pool there. More than a possibility, a probability of a pool there. So now you can say, Well, geez, he doesn't have to rely on somebody coming out and flagging. Now it's in the process. He can say, well, we've mapped vernal pools in the town and there's a potential vernal pool there. We need to look at that. So now it's early in the game. And now it's already on the table. And then we can go out and say, or you can have the wetland agent, and you can also say, and by the way, we want you to collect this data on the pool to see, so that we can feed it into our information, so that we can make some more informed decisions about that. But it allows him to be more focused, and allows our commission now to have information up front. How well it'll work, we will see. And it's important not just for development, but as I mentioned, one of the things to me that is forestry applications, because they're by right. Agriculture, which forestry falls under, is by right. It doesn't mean you can do anything you want to do. If you're going to fill in a wetland or even a temporary fill, you can require a permit. The problem is catching those. There's a lot of forestry operations going on where they don't even submit. So the wetland agent doesn't even know until it's after the fact. And you rely a lot on the landowner being aware of it. So one of the things we're gonna think about is, how do we catch this in a better way so that, you can go in and you say, okay, look, all right, you wanna do a forestry here? Well, maybe you wanna put your skidder road over here because it won't bisect these, we've got 2 pools here. So how do we do, those are the process implementations we
Are
need.
you one of the towns that has forestry regulations?
No, those are a small number of towns.
Yeah, I know, I live in
Yeah,
Haddam and we
no.
have those and we.
Yeah, you wanna, and no new towns can join, I don't.
Oh, they can't?
I don't believe so. I think they basically sunsetted that whole thing. I don't know how that started up, but I remember looking at, because I looked at that. Because I remember thinking, what's this? Thinking opportunity, but somebody slammed that door shut. Yeah, so that's one where, because right now, forestry is, the agriculture and forestry, they're basically, they can do a lot of things where, and the challenge is these systems, they can withstand the forestry if done well. And forestry is a temporary impact on that system. It's how you do it. And, that it's really comes down to best management practices, but unless you catch it. And by the way, if they tell you they're doing best management practices, my experience and data says they're not necessarily doing best management practices. So, we need to have a little bit more review of that and ownership of how do we provide some guidance on this. And those are the dilemmas. So this is sort of where we're going on it. We've done all of our mapping and data collection. We're now in that process of wrestling with implementation. Next slide, please. All right. So just a couple of other things to consider as you're mapping. What are the things that you have to consider on the landscape that are resistant to those vernal pool critters? Well, research shows that forest cover is critical. Loss of forest cover has impacts. If it's temporary, it'll be a temporary impact. Unless it's growth, okay? The soil structure is completely dealt with. But again, it depends on how fragmented the site is, how big of an impact it will have. So forest cover is critical within a large area around that vernal pool. Topography has shown for some species like marbled salamander to have an impact on their ability to disperse. I do not believe that's really an issue unless you're up in Northwest Connecticut, where the higher elevations, marbled salamander is a southern species. Where you guys are, you don't have those high elevations where I think it would be a detriment any of the areas for dispersal of critters. Roads, on the other hand, are significant. They have a significant impact, both with road mortality and also indirect impacts on the forest ecosystem and on the associated wetlands and vernal pools. And there's lots of literature. So those are the type of things that are resistant to these animals. In your area, I would worry about forest cover and roads. Those are the things that you want to maintain forest cover and avoid roads. And if you got to do roads, you want to do them in a sensitive way and place them best and use things like Cape Cod curbs or no curbs. I mean, you've got to look at various mitigation. Okay. So those are considerations. Here's examples. This is Army Corps. So they use, one of the things Aram Calhoun and Michael Clemens found out after they published the best development practices was it wasn't enough to look at the zones. you really had to look at the direction and you had to look at connectivity to these larger pieces. So this isn't a theoretical example. There's the vernal pool in the middle, the 100-foot zone and the 750-foot zone. And then you got the area development over there, and the green's all forest. You can see the wetland, okay? Move on to the next slide, please. This is an example of thinking of it differently based on the organisms. So the wood frog, they seasonally use the vernal pool just like the spotted salamander. So the vernal pool and the immediate 100 feet around is important for both of those organisms. In the summer, the wood frog, however, is using not just forest, it goes into other wetlands. It requires a more humid and water courses in wetlands. So rather than having a higher percentage of forest around the second critical zone, outside away from 100 feet, it may be better to actually get more percentage of forest cover connecting to that wetland system as a priority, versus the spotted salamander, where they're less interested in that wetland up there. They need more forest cover, so preserving a greater percentage of forest cover, but still maintaining connectivity to the wetland in case there's some level of breeding occurring between them. So recognizing that in these cases, recognizing not using just the circles, but thinking about it from the larger landscape. And I would argue that's correct. And I would argue that you want to go beyond this, from a planning standpoint, you want to go beyond that, like we did with the zones, and think about how do I maintain these connectivity and an adequate percentage of forest to make sure that these things can adjust and these systems can maintain an ecosystem health under the challenges that are occurring. Because make no mistake, when you put development in, while those projects would certainly be good projects to mitigate impacts on those wetland systems and the vernal pool community, they will have impacts on the forest. I mean, that you cannot do development without having impacts on, so there will be impacts on that system. So what you're doing is you're trying to preserve a good chunk to give it an intact nature, knowing that the other side of it is pretty well forested. Next slide. So how do we translate that into all this information? How do we translate it into knowledge and action? So here's what I would say are your top goals. And this gets to your earlier point. Number one is permanent preservation. How do we get more land permanently preserved? What uses you have in it as far as recreational and forest management is a separate question that can be based on best management and so forth. But how do we preserve more land? And we need to do that. And if I could wave a magic wand and say, okay, what one thing conservation we could do, it would be to have land trusts, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, every environmental group that does any stewardship that's involved with land and conservation easements or acquisition, and the state of Connecticut buy more land, but do it strategically. They would go through a state mapping exercise using ecoregions, figure out the areas that are already intact and build like hell out from them. Build along all those major basalt ridges and those major ecosystem areas. Not worry about, is there a spadefoot toad in there? If you preserve it and it's there, it'll be there. If it's not, it'll take us 10 years, to your point, to find it. By that time, it'll be too damn late. So that would be is get as much as you can and preserve it. We need intact systems, but we need to do it strategically. Getting an acre here and an acre here isn't going to do it. And it's not doing it. I can tell you from the research we did on this, looking at all the areas that we've gone on that approach, it ain't working. It's not. Number two, the second thing you need to do is those earlier examples is mitigation. So in other words, if you can't do that, if there's sites where you can't protect it, preserve it, the next step is how do we make sure if they're going to be a use in it, whether it's forestry, whether it's residential development, whether it's recreational trails, how do we make sure it happens and we maintain that ecological integrity and health of that system? And that gets at things like, okay, if you're going to do forestry, do it off-season, smooth your ruts. Here's where you locate your skidder trails. Do it in a way where you're going to have as minimal impact as possible. If it's residential development, designing that development to have a footprint that's as least impactful as possible. That's what mitigation is, using Cape Cod curves or no curves, those types of things to mitigate against that. Some of these species will be able to survive in those type of systems if we leave enough intact habitat and larger landscape connectivity. And some may be able to adapt to some of these changes, but we have to think about it, and we can't do that if we do it in a reactionary way. That's why you have to have the information up front, because then it allows you to get ahead of it and do that. The next one is restoration. And that should only be if somebody has gone in and filled the vernal pool. And then they get caught. And I know of a case, it's gonna hit, and they get caught. And okay, you need to restore that. You fill the vernal pool. It can be potentially restored. You know, if the parent soil is still, you could potentially do that. Or person who screwed it up. Creation, that was often talked about for many years and still in some cases. I would say it ain't feasible. You can create wetlands that are going to attract amphibians to breed, but not the vernal pool community as a whole. And you're not going to replicate the natural functions. You're just not. Rob Calhoun has written extensively on this from research. You know, wetlands that are created, especially for vernal pool creatures, for long-term success of that is, I don't think it's feasible. I think that's makes us feel good. And in some cases, it's great for things, you know, for American toads and things like that, and a variety of species, there's a value associated with that. You know, if you're in areas that are already compromised, there's a value to some of those systems, but it in no way equates to loss of natural systems. And it should not be considered, in my view, it should not be considered as an option for conservation. I think that the first two in those orders are critical. But again, I say strategically, you don't, from a preservation standpoint, you want to be looking, because money, I mean, to get money for land use, you want to preserve the areas that you need to do. And it's a battle. I've faced that in my own town where, you know, why do you want to spend our open space funding on this one? Why not this one over here? This one's, you know, because we have to get rid of those individual biases that we have in some cases. And if you have the data to back up your decisions, you'll be able to, I was easily able to, in my case, I was easily able to say, here's why. let's look at these and see why. You know, that's what you need to be able to do. And that's why you get it up front. Almost done. All right, so the roles. Municipal commissions are critical, especially around the plan of conservation development. That's your opportunity to get the information in, natural resource inventories, review the regulations. Your conservation commissions should be reviewing the regulations, even though they're not regulatory, making suggestions. Do we have adequate open review areas? Do we have, you know, are we using our forest? If you have the forestry regulations, are we using them effectively? You know, review them, make suggestions. Are we included in the review process? Things like that. You need to build sort of, your roles. I think that conservation commissions in Connecticut are woefully underused. They have power. They don't have regulatory power, which I think is actually a benefit, because it doesn't, constrain them like wetland commission is constrained, but they should use that. They should use that to promote both the landowners and to their other commissions, planning and zoning, and they should advocate for. Because in many cases, what I'm seeing is that wetlands commissions aren't advocating strong enough for the wetlands. And the conservation commissions can hold their feet to the fire and be at that meeting and say, really, you're thinking about driving that skidder through that wetland? Really, you think you want to make that decision? You can do that. Inland wetland and watercourse commissions are critical. Go to the training, go to the CACI WICs, participate, learn, and constantly review those regulations and see, what can we do? The challenge and tackle those challenging things like by right of with forestry. How do we deal with that? If we're not able to see, if we're not seeing applications for forestry, and yet there's impacts on them, how do we solve that problem?
Isn't Deep supposed to review them?
Review what?
The forestry applications for, towns that don't have inland wetlands reviewing them?
News to me.
Oh,
Uh,
that was my impression.
I think I've heard that they're working on a notification
I know they're
system.
so understaffed. and
Yeah,
that's-
I would say I would not rely on the state for anything more than guidance. I mean, that's typically the role the state has in Connecticut. I mean, we do things at the municipal level. So my view is you take ownership of it and figure out, work with planning and zoning and say, hey, this is a problem. How do we deal with this? And then if you need to reach out to the state folks, reach out to state folks for advice. Kakiwik, you can go to Kakiwik and get legal advice. You know, when, Mark Branson, those folks get up and they talk about court cases and you can ask questions, you can get advice. There's ways to build the ability to do the work that you need to do as the commissions. With the Conservation Commission, what I know about the Conservation Commission, because you're not regulatory, you can really take the bully pulpit on pushing for, advocating for the conservation planning, doing the mapping, doing the inventories, advocate for, fees in lieu of, and, putting money into open space funds and things like that. You can do it. If we can do it in Andover with 3,000 people, we're pretty fiscally, folks are like, what's spent on what? If we can put money away for open space, and we can do fee in lieu of, other towns can do it. Planning and Zoning Commission obviously is key there, but there needs to be more coordination between them. There needs to be more talking. Land trusts are critical. And they also manage lands. So again, how those lands are managed, in the best in the best management process, if they're managed. But they can play key roles. So if you have land trusts, like with us, Joshua's Trust is within our catchment area. So we can work very closely with Joshua's Trust on helping, hey, we want to purchase this property. Can we work with you to, help seal up our, because you're sophisticated, you have, you've done this, you've been around to help us with applications to the state and, to support letters. And, if we're putting in trails, can you help, with that process? I mean, you can develop relationships with the land trusts within your towns and with, with various entities. Networking is critical. If we're going to do this, if it's going to work, the folks that are interested in it need to do more work together to move it forward, because there's so many folks that say, we can't do that, we can't do that. And we need to do it. And then landowners. The funny one I'll tell you about landowners is, to me, they're the solution to the forestry problem, because it's the landowner's property. They actually call the shot, not the forester. So if the landowner wants it done this way, that's the way it's going to get done. So, but if the forester's telling them, oh, no, we're gonna do board feed X and this, and we're gonna do, But if somebody says, well, wait a minute, I don't want you to put the Skeeter trail through here, and I don't want you to cut those 10 trees around that vernal pool because it's right on the edge. And you've got the landowner there. And the landowner support. And it's like, then you've got advocacy to now say, okay, well, because the landowner calls that shit. Landowner can say to that part, hey, I'm hiring you to do this. It's the way I want it done. I believe in that vernal pool. I don't want you, I'm willing to sacrifice the $80 a tree for those 5 trees. Don't cut those trees. Put your Skeeter trail over here. That type of thing. Or make sure you come back and fill those ruts in. But right now, that's what isn't happening a lot of times. So engaging the landowners, but it's hard to do. When we reached out with the vernal pools, we got very little, because when you do something in writing and you go out to them, folks that I would write to, that we would write to through our commission, asking for permission, we would get nothing back. When I would go to a meeting and I would see them, I'd go up and ask, hey, we're doing a vernal pool survey. Can we go to survey, access your property? Well, how many times are you gonna come out? We just need to come out 2 times, once in March, once in April. Yeah, sure. Different thing. So it's how you go about it, and you have to know your town, know your population, know your folks, and engage them and have them sort of show them maps. Maps tell a story. Show them. This is why. Look at this. When they see those landscapes from up above, many times they haven't seen their property now. Look, see, here's the vernal pools. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to maintain connectivity. It's like your road to getting to the plaza. It's important. This is their road getting to there. This is why it's important for them. You know, so this is why we don't want to do this, you know, can we do this? You know, that, and you can also start to have the conversations with landowners, especially landowners over 10 acres. You know, what are you thinking of doing with your property? And what's the long-term plans for your property? You can, before these things go on the market, you can start, because to my earlier priority number one, get more land. Even if it's in conservation easements. Get more land, you know, but when we wait, we should be having the conversations that land trusts can do this, conservation commissions can do this, because the folks that sit on them know landowners. And then once you've got a landowner, it's helpful, you can use that landowner to get other landowners. You know, we're doing that, trying to promote some NRCS initiatives that can be beneficial to landowners, using landowners as advocates that are in the program to bring in other landowners. So those are the networks you need to build. That's the implementation. But you want to do that armed with information. And I think my last slide, hopefully. Go skip that one. Okay. You need to start. You just need to do it. I see too often where folks, they feel like they have to do it in a sophisticated way. And the reality of it is it doesn't take a big budget. You don't need to hire a lot of consultants. I mean, in Andover, we're doing it, we're not spending a dime on it. We're doing it with our commission, and we're doing it using CP Eco data, and we're doing it using free ArcGIS. So when we needed higher power GIS, we partnered with the University of Connecticut Climate Corps. We had 2 students and 2 faculty to work with on our mapping. So when we needed higher power GIS, they were able to do it for us. You know, so we could work with them. You know, they helped meet a resource need that we were lacking. We worked with Joshua's Trust to help identify, you know, as we were thinking through an application for a large area with vernal pools. We reached out to Joshua's Trust, a land trust within our catchment area. So there are ways that you can do it. There is data out there. There's information out there that you can do it. Folks that you can talk to, you know, to get guidance on it. And it doesn't have to be lots of surveys, you know, for all these species. It can be, if you have the ability to do that, great. The more information, the better to guide it, but it shouldn't hold you up, because the reality of it is, just with the maps, just with the ecoregion maps, the wetlands maps, there are gaps like the vernal pool maps. We don't have one. So if you don't have one, get one. And it's not, I'm telling you, with the satellite mapping today, you can do it. You can do it. It's not onerous. There's a wealth of maps and data out there, and there's more coming online all the time. And using that information can get you a long way, toward identifying the areas that really are priority areas within your catchment areas. And then it's banding together your land trust, your folks within your catchment area to say, okay, what are we having problems with? You know, is it the forestry applications? Is it, you know, we need to reach out to landowners and try to see who owns these properties? All that information is available. It's all available. It's all there. You can identify the landowners. You know, it's all there. It's just a matter of it's the inertia of getting over it. You know, I'm a guitar player. I love to play guitar. And it's that, but practice, you know, it's just like, you know, you sit there, you know, you read, doing a crossword puzzle or something, having a cup of coffee. I try to play every day. And I'm like, no, I just think I'll play today. What I find with most things, it's once you get past that 1 minute of inertia, once you pick it up, it goes away. And I'm playing for an hour too. Once you say, okay, we're going to do this map, and you start it, all of a sudden it goes away. That barrier goes away. In that first minute, it goes away. But it's that first minute you got to get past the, you know, I don't want, and man, you know, it's GIS and you know, I haven't done this. The ArcView, and even the private public one it's a little funky, but you know what? Once you get into it, once you do it, once you create a map, it's like, all right, I'm there.
When I was in grad school, GIS was a program of Fortran on cards and then data points after that.
Me too.
Yeah, so, you know, what you have now is just so much nicer than that. I could have never imagined that it would get so usable.
I mean, in 15 minutes, I can sit down on a free
Yeah.
ArcGIS program and layer a map together for particular projects
Yeah,
very readily. I mean, I can access the data sets readily. I mean, the robust data sets. If I run into a problem, there's many people to call that, that will help you through it. I mean, there's even the online stuff you can type in. Again, it's that inertia. And I think, once you get into it, and to me, maps are magical because they show people things that they typically don't see. And it can be fascinating and it's a way of engaging your landowners. It's a way of engaging communities and showing why things are important in a way where you can win the day on a conservation standpoint. And there's so much of it out there now. It's just getting over that inertia of logging on the damn computer after you've been on Zoom for 4 hours or, it's that inert. Once you get over that, I'm telling you, try it 1 minute. Once you get past, as soon as I pick up the guitar, it takes me 1 minute to take it out of the case, pick it up. As soon as it's in my lap, it's a rare occasion when that guitar goes down outside of an hour later, because I've gotten past the inertia of, oh, I've got to do this. And all of a sudden it's like, I'm in it. And I feel great. And I feel good after because I did it. The same taking a walk. I try to take a walk every day, I did it. So I argue, do it. Just do it. Don't get caught in the process of, oh, we need to bring in this consultant. We need to do 20 different maps and all this. Go in and say, how do we get our arms around the town of the concept? You guys, it sounds like you're already there. I mean, from what I've heard, you've got conservation planning going, and I know some of the stuff you're doing around the river and so forth. Sounds like you guys are in pretty decent shape. But the other piece is it's a living thing. It's not something where you can just sort of put it away because things change. Land use changes, properties change hands, new opportunities come up. And I think one of the great opportunities is because we as people have to retrofit our infrastructure around climate change. There's the opportunity for us to get involved and say, okay, like on the Hop River, they need to put new bridges in on all those old infrastructure. There's a chance to weigh in on how do we make them more ecologically sustainable now? Because now you're part of the planning process. So now you're actually righting a wrong that was done, people didn't even know it was wrong. But now because of the need to upgrade infrastructure, there's now an opportunity to add ecology back into that equation. That would be great. I mean, if we did more of that, sharing the landscape, right, Jim? So I'm gonna leave it at that. I've taken way too much of your time.
I have a question. At my next East Haddam Land Trust meeting, these are the suggestions I want to make, and just want to get your views on it based on your presentation. I would encourage my land trust to do a VP survey based on free GIS capabilities, satellite imaging, wetland maps. Second, to do a plan of protection that focuses on cover of forests, and also to replace any type of dying trees that might be shading the pool. And also not to sort of not map hiking trails near VPs.
Yeah, the first start would be, so you're talking about land trust on your land trust property.
Yeah, right.
Okay, yeah, so to me, it would be, the key with the properties is understanding where are my properties, how contiguous and connected. If you're doing vernal pool mapping would be great. I mean, where are the vernal pools within them? And again, I would look at like an eco-region map to say, are there unique aspects associated with particular ones? So in other words, if you have property, what town were you?
East Haddam.
East Haddam. I'd have to look at the eco-region map to see what different regions you fall within. But you layer those different ones on to look at if there's an area that is particularly unique, like say it fell within Basalt Ridge. You don't have that in East Haddam, but say it did. That would be an example of something you would want to say, okay, that is a unique system because it's the only area of Basalt Ridge, and that's of regional statewide concern. Okay. And if you're mapping the pools, then you have to make a decision whether you're going to collect data on those pools, or are you just going to map their potential occurrence and say, That's good enough for us now. We're gonna use that in our planning. We're gonna use that in our planning process. We're gonna consider that there's potential pools there. We're gonna use it. You're welcome. Thank you. I wouldn't worry about, you talk about taking trees. I wouldn't worry about anything like that, okay, right now. I would worry more about mapping the pools. And if you get other information from them, great, but if not, proceed with that. Then I would look at and say, what's the, this gets back to your larger properties. Do we have properties that are connected? And you may already be doing this. So in other words, if you've got disparate locations for your land trust
Most
properties,
of our stuff is connected.
that's great. All right, so, and if there's gaps, then I would look at those gaps. So any gaps that you have of ownership that would serve as connectors where you have pools and forest. And the two layers I would look at is if you map your vernal pools, I would look at a core forest layer. The DEP, I believe, has a core forest layer now. It's generally, those are areas that are at least 300 feet away from any edge, like development edge or road edges. So core forests generally are considered to be fairly ecologically intact. So if you've got core forest, you know that it's ecologically healthy. So if you've got with your core forest layer and your vernal pool layer, and then you look at your gaps, where are the properties that we don't own or that are not in other protections, state lands or conservation easements or things like that, and identify those, because to me, they would, and if you find ones that are, boy, this one would be important because it's core forest and it's got two pools in it or whatever, and it would connect this system, you would want to prioritize that. You say, okay, that would be an important one. Who's the landowner? I mean, so you could then identify strategically where are parcels that would help us build out our land trust network strategically based on core forest and vernal pools. You could do it with other resources too, if you wanted to, wetlands and other, sandy gravel. I mean, there's other resources you could do the same exercise. I'm just talking about it from vernal pools now. But that's the type of approach you would do from a planning standpoint. From a land trust, it's fairly easy because you use a land trust, you could say, we're going to prioritize these areas for acquisition or for easements. And then you would, however you implement to try to get those, I would argue be proactive, contact landowners, figure out ways, have a social, have an event where you bring out the map and show them, say, hey, here's our land trust properties. Here's the gaps. That's you. This is an important piece and here's why. Start those conversations because those are often long-term building to try to get, to try to pave the way for conservation of those properties. But you can't do that for every property. You want to do it for the ones strategically. So that's the approach that I would take.
I'll take this time right now. I know that we're about an hour past the.
I apologize.
No, it's
really
quite all right. This was excellent.
I really do.
I want to first thank you on behalf of the Land Trust for coming today. I encourage everyone to reach out if you have additional questions. I myself have to leave as well. But thank you very much for being here. The information was very.
My contact information is, where is it? No, go one more. There it is. So you can just email me if you want. I'd be happy to send you anything if you need anything. So let me know. All right.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today.
Yep.
Appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of your summer.
Yeah, you guys do.
Thank you. One.
Oh, I'll change the screen.